They were the enemy, men who once marched under the black flag of the Reich, shouting for conquest and glory. Now, behind barbed wire in the heart of America, they waited, stripped of rank, stripped of power, yet still proud. They expected punishment, humiliation, perhaps even hatred. But instead, they were handed baseball gloves. As the sun fell over the dusty fields of the POW camp, German soldiers found themselves standing on a diamond, staring at a strange white ball flying through the air. For the first time since the war began, they were not prisoners or soldiers, they were players. Laughter replaced orders. Competition replaced fear. And as the crack of a bat echoed across the camp, something remarkable happened. Enemies became teammates, and the sound of war was replaced by the sound of peace. This is their forgotten story. When German POWs first arrived on American soil, they braced themselves for cruelty. Many had been told that capture by the Allies meant starvation, abuse, and humiliation. But what awaited them behind the fences of camps in Texas, Georgia, and Kansas was something they could never have imagined. Instead of darkness, they found sunlight. Instead of hatred, they found order, and even kindness. The guards treated them not as monsters, but as men. They were given food, shelter, books, and even the freedom to organize their own activities. It was within this strange calm that a uniquely American tradition made its way into the camps: baseball. At first, it seemed absurd. German soldiers, many of whom had never seen the sport before, watched as Americans swung bats and shouted across fields. But slowly, curiosity turned into fascination, and fascination into participation. Soon, the crack of wooden bats echoed through barbed wire fences, uniting men once divided by war. What began as a simple game became something far greater, a quiet rebellion against hate, and a small glimpse of humanity in a world torn apart by violence. The war in Europe had reached its boiling point by 1944. The Allies had landed in Normandy, and German divisions were collapsing under the weight of superior numbers, endless air raids, and exhaustion. Tens of thousands of German soldiers laid down their arms, not out of cowardice, but out of simple survival. They were done fighting for a cause that had already devoured their homeland. When American forces captured them, these men expected the worst. They had been fed stories by Nazi propaganda, that Americans tortured prisoners, starved them, and sent them to die in nameless camps. Fear gripped them as they boarded ships bound for an unknown land across the Atlantic. For many, it was the first time they had ever seen the vast ocean, a cold, endless stretch that symbolized defeat and exile. The journey was long and silent. Men huddled together, whispering about their families, wondering if they would ever see Germany again. Some clutched rosaries. Others held photographs of wives and children, now reduced to faded memories. When they finally saw the American coast, it felt unreal, a world so different from the bombed ruins of Europe. Their first glimpse of America wasn't New York or Washington, but sprawling fields and wide skies. They were taken inland, to fenced compounds surrounded by barbed wire, guard towers, and floodlights. But instead of the brutality they expected, they found discipline mixed with something strange: decency. The guards didn't yell. They didn't strike. They simply enforced rules, like soldiers doing their duty. Inside the camps, order replaced chaos. The prisoners were assigned barracks, given clean clothes marked PW for prisoner of war, and fed 3 times a day. Meals weren't lavish, but they were plentiful: bread, beans, meat, even coffee. For soldiers who had survived on frozen potatoes and fear during the last months of war, it felt like luxury. The shock was overwhelming. Some refused to believe it. "This is propaganda," one prisoner muttered. Others thought it was a trick, that kindness was a weapon meant to break their pride. But days turned into weeks, and the treatment remained the same. They could write letters home, attend church services, and even receive Red Cross parcels. Books were allowed. Newspapers too, though censored. A few men began to realize something powerful: the enemy they had been told to hate was not what they imagined. America was fighting the Nazis, yes, but not to destroy Germans. Within the camps, a strange transformation began. Instead of plotting escape or revenge, the men started organizing small groups, art clubs, language classes, even music ensembles. Some of them had been teachers, bakers, or students before the war. Behind the wire, they rediscovered those parts of themselves. One American guard, Sergeant Miller, recalled years later. They were soldiers, just like us. Tired, hungry, and homesick. The only difference was the flag they fought under. The camp fences kept them in, but they could not contain curiosity. The Germans watched American soldiers on weekends, playing a strange game with bats and gloves. They didn't understand the rules, but they could see the joy. And for the first time since their surrender, they felt something unfamiliar: longing. They didn't know it yet, but that curiosity would soon change everything. Within months, those same prisoners would stand on dusty fields, laughing, running, and shouting in a language not their own. The war had stolen their pride, but baseball would give them back their humanity. Life inside the American POW camps soon developed a rhythm. Each morning began with the sound of a whistle and the clang of metal doors. German prisoners lined up in neat formations, answering roll call as the American guards took attendance. The air was often cool, filled with the smell of breakfast and dust. After roll call, the prisoners were divided into work details. Some tended to camp gardens, others repaired fences, cooked meals, or cleaned the barracks. It was structured, repetitive, but it gave them something they hadn't felt in months: purpose. Even as prisoners, they could build, fix, and create. Over time, the monotony of captivity gave rise to small pockets of culture and creativity. A group of former teachers started an informal school, offering lessons in mathematics, English, and history. One prisoner taught woodworking, using scrap wood to carve chess sets and toys. Others painted murals on the walls, scenes of villages, forests, and the Rhine River they so deeply missed. Letters from home arrived once a month, written in trembling ink. Each envelope carried both hope and pain. News from Germany was grim: cities in ruins, families displaced, uncertainty everywhere. But even that distant sorrow reminded them of who they were fighting for, or rather, who they wanted to fight for. The American guards watched all this quietly. Some treated their captives with professional distance, others with genuine curiosity. For many young Americans, these Germans were the first enemy they had ever spoken to face to face. They didn't look like monsters. They looked like men. At night, the camp was quiet except for the hum of crickets and the occasional bark of a guard dog. In those silent hours, laughter would sometimes rise from the barracks, faint, cautious laughter. Someone might tell a joke about army rations, or hum a tune from home. For a few fleeting moments, war felt like a faraway dream. One prisoner, a young Bavarian named Ernst, kept a journal. He wrote, "We live in cages, but we are treated as human beings. The Americans are not cruel. They are proud, but fair. Perhaps this is what Germany has forgotten." Those words, smuggled out years later, became one of the few first-hand accounts of daily life inside a US POW camp. His reflections echoed what many others quietly felt: confusion, gratitude, and a slow awakening to a different kind of freedom. Because behind the fences, something invisible was happening. The propaganda that had fueled their hatred began to fade. They saw the America that wasn't printed in Nazi pamphlets, the land of opportunity, music, and democracy. Some began to question the ideals they had been raised with. Others found faith again after years of violence and loss. Sports became a natural outlet for this transformation. At first, prisoners played soccer, their national game. They fashioned makeshift goals out of wood, and the open fields echoed with the sound of shouts in German. Even the guards occasionally stopped to watch, admiring the skill and passion of their former enemies. But as time passed, a new game began to take hold, one that was deeply American. Baseball. The guards played it every weekend, shouting strange words like home run and strike. The prisoners stood at the fences, watching with fascination. They didn't understand the rules, but they recognized the joy. And within those joyful sounds, a spark was lit. The barbed wire could keep them inside, but it couldn't stop curiosity. And soon, that curiosity would lead them to something far greater than freedom. It would lead them to understanding. It began with a simple question shouted through the fence. A young German prisoner, fascinated by the sight of American soldiers swinging bats under the afternoon sun, called out in broken English. "What is this game?" The guard laughed, tossing the ball lightly in his hand. "Baseball," he said. "America's favorite game." The name meant nothing to the Germans, but the spirit behind it, the teamwork, the noise, the strange mixture of discipline and joy, stirred something inside them. To men who had been soldiers all their adult lives, this was something new. A game not about survival, but about connection. Within weeks, requests began to trickle in. Could the prisoners, too, learn to play? The camp commander, a fair and pragmatic man, saw no harm in it. He approved the idea, perhaps not realizing that it would transform the mood of the entire camp. The Americans supplied old bats, worn gloves, and a few scuffed baseballs. The Germans, with their love of structure and rules, set out to learn. At first, it was chaos. Pitchers hurled the ball like artillery shells, missing by miles. Batters swung wildly, sending dust instead of baseballs into the air. Catchers' mitts clapped awkwardly against untrained hands. The guards laughed, not unkindly, as the prisoners stumbled their way through the basics. But the Germans, disciplined as ever, took it seriously. They studied the rules. They practiced for hours. And slowly, something began to change. By late summer, the fields inside the camp had been marked with chalk lines and bases carved from scraps of wood. The Germans formed teams, each representing a barrack, and tournaments began. The guards came to watch, leaning on the fences, cheering, even placing small bets. Soon, the entire camp, Americans and Germans alike, lived for those afternoon games. One American sergeant wrote in his diary, "It's the damnedest thing I've ever seen. These guys were fighting us a few months ago, and now they're arguing about strike zones and home runs like they've been playing for years. What started as a pastime became a bridge." Language barriers melted away, replaced by the universal language of sport. When a German batter hit his first home run, cheers erupted, not just from prisoners, but from guards as well. For a few moments, the war didn't matter. They were all just men under the same sun, playing a game that felt more like peace than anything else they'd known in years. For many POWs, baseball became therapy. It gave rhythm to their days, a reason to laugh, a reminder of life beyond survival. Some began carving small baseball figures out of wood, painting them with the names of their teams. Others wrote letters home describing the games, baffling their families who could hardly believe what they read. "America has let us play baseball, imagine that." The news spread between camps, carried by transferred prisoners and visiting officers. Soon, baseball was being played in POW camps across the United States, from the pine forests of Georgia to the plains of Texas. Entire leagues formed, with handwritten scorecards and homemade trophies. Camps competed in friendly matches, and even American guards joined in. But the most extraordinary thing wasn't the game itself, it was what it revealed. The German POWs began to see the Americans not as enemies, but as people. They learned that courage wasn't limited to one uniform. And the Americans, in turn, saw their captives not as fanatics, but as young men caught in the machinery of war. One photograph from 1945 captures it perfectly. A German prisoner, dusty and smiling, stands on first base while an American guard pats him on the back. Both are laughing, frozen in a moment where history itself seems to pause. Behind barbed wire, baseball had done what diplomacy could not, it had built understanding. In the midst of war, it became a small symbol of peace, played out on fields fenced by wire and watched by rifles that, for a few blessed hours, stayed silent. As the seasons changed, so did the spirit of the camp. By the time spring returned, the once grim rows of barracks had turned into a small community. The prisoners, once suspicious and withdrawn, now laughed openly. Baseball had become the pulse of their days, the thing that reminded them that even in captivity, they were still alive. Every afternoon, the field came alive with energy. Dust rose beneath the pounding of boots, and cheers echoed across the wire fences. The Germans had even begun using American slang, shouting, "safe," or "out," with thick accents that made the guards grin. It was hard to believe that these were the same men who had marched across Europe in iron helmets just months before. Competition grew fierce. Each barrack had its own team, its own pride, and its own traditions. The prisoners designed team logos on scraps of cloth, eagles, lightning bolts, even humorous symbols poking fun at their own military ranks. Their creativity shone through in every corner of camp life. There were small posters announcing game schedules, crude scoreboards painted on walls, and even mock commentators who called plays in dramatic voices, echoing the style of American radio. What began as a distraction became something sacred. The game blurred the lines between captor and captive. The guards, once distant figures with rifles, became coaches, teammates, and even friends. They taught the prisoners batting techniques, shared stories of playing in little leagues back home, and laughed when the Germans imitated American gestures. One afternoon, an unexpected storm swept across the camp. Thunder rolled, and rain poured down, turning the field into a sea of mud. Most of the camp rushed to take shelter, but a few players stayed behind, Germans and Americans both, sliding through the muck, shouting and laughing as they played on. When the commander saw them, he didn't stop them. He just smiled. For a moment, even nature itself seemed to pause and watch men who had forgotten they were supposed to be enemies. These shared moments did something profound. They broke through years of propaganda and mistrust. The prisoners began to see that the enemy had families, humor, and dreams just like their own. The guards, many barely older than the prisoners, saw the same thing, that courage and decency were not bound by nationality. Letters sent home reflected this growing humanity. One German wrote to his wife, "I play baseball now. The Americans are kind, not cruel. They laugh easily. I think often of what peace might feel like, and I believe it could look something like this." For the guards, too, these experiences left deep impressions. Private Daniels, who had lost his brother in the Battle of the Bulge, later admitted, "I hated them when they arrived. But after months of watching them play ball, I couldn't. They were just boys. Just like us." By the summer of 1945, the games had become so popular that visiting officers from nearby towns came to watch. Civilians brought lemonade and snacks, cheering for their favorite teams. No one could have imagined such a sight in the middle of a world at war, German POWs and American soldiers, laughing together on an American field. And when the war finally ended, and word reached the camps that Germany had surrendered, the baseball fields fell silent for the first time in months. Some prisoners wept openly. They didn't cheer for victory or defeat, they mourned the end of something pure, something that had shown them what peace could truly be. In the days that followed, many of them were prepared for transport back to Europe. Before leaving, the final game was played, Germans against Americans, one last time. No uniforms, no ranks, no flags. Just men, bound by the rhythm of a game that had taught them more about humanity than war ever could. As the final ball soared through the sky and landed in the outfield, both sides erupted in cheers. No one cared who won. Because, for once, everyone had. When the war finally ended, the barbed wire began to lose its meaning. For years, it had divided men by nationality and duty, but now, it stood as a reminder of how quickly enemies could become friends. The camps slowly emptied as ships were prepared to return the prisoners home. Some of the guards shook hands with the men they once watched over, pressing small gifts into their palms, a baseball, a glove, a photograph taken beside the field. For many German prisoners, saying goodbye was unexpectedly painful. America, the land they had once been told to fear, had treated them with a strange and unforgettable kindness. They left not as broken men, but as witnesses to something rare, the idea that even in war, humanity could survive. One POW wrote in his final letter before boarding the ship. "They gave us food, dignity, and baseball. I will never forget the sound of laughter inside the fences." Back in Germany, the memories of those dusty games followed them. Some returned to cities reduced to ashes, carrying baseballs as souvenirs from a life that felt like another world. They told their families about the Americans, not as monsters, but as men who had shared a field, a smile, and a moment of peace. A few of them even tried to teach baseball to their children. In the late 1940s, makeshift games appeared in small German towns, played with improvised bats and balls. To those who knew, it wasn't just a game, it was a memory, a symbol of hope. Decades later, historians would uncover photographs and letters from those camps, faded black and white images of smiling men in tattered uniforms, standing shoulder to shoulder, some wearing armbands marked PW, others in American caps. The expressions on their faces said everything words could not, that war had divided them, but sport had united them. In a time when the world was tearing itself apart, a handful of men found a way to remember what it meant to be human. They discovered that compassion could live even behind barbed wire. That friendship could grow in the shadow of conflict. And that sometimes, the greatest victories aren't won on battlefields, but on quiet fields of dust, beneath the sound of cheering voices and the crack of a wooden bat. When the gates of the camps finally opened, the prisoners didn't just walk toward freedom, they carried with them a story. A story of redemption, resilience, and the healing power of something as simple as a game. And long after the fences rusted away, the echoes of that laughter still remained, a forgotten legacy of the war that proved one eternal truth. Even in humanity's darkest hour, kindness could still find a way to play. As history moved forward and the world rebuilt itself from the ashes of war, the story of those games faded into silence. Few ever spoke of the days when barbed wire surrounded baseball fields, or when laughter rose above the fences that once divided nations. But for those who lived it, the memory never disappeared. They carried it home in their hearts, the sound of bats striking balls, of cheers replacing gunfire, of humanity reborn through something as simple as play. Years later, when veterans on both sides looked back, many confessed that those games taught them more about peace than any treaty ever could. They learned that the true victory wasn't won with bombs or bullets, but with forgiveness. Because behind every uniform, there was still a man. And behind every war, there's always a moment, however brief, when enemies remember how to be human again.